who lives in Lexington, Virginia.
Charlottesville.
Oh, you're in Charlottesville. Why do I have you in Lexington?
Just moved a few months ago.
I see. Okay, she's now in Charlottesville, where University of Virginia is. And she sent me her CV as background, and I realized as I was looking at it, she has the perfect CV to be a biographer. Okay? For one thing, she was an English major. And then she got a master's in Anglo-Irish literature. Mm-hmm. And then she got a degree in library science, so she really knows how to do research. All right? So she has been a professional librarian, especially a law librarian, so she knows how to really go through legal documents and government documents very well. She's also a journalist. She has written and she has appeared on television quite a bit. On my favorite show, C-SPAN's Book TV, HBO Real Sports, The Charlie Rose Show, and PBS History Detective. So she's on the small screen. She's also done a lot of radio work for National Public Radio, American Public Media, and for the BBC in England. So she has a lot of different kinds of journalistic experience. The other thing she has done is she's been an organizer. She organizes nonprofits, fundraises for them, establishes protocols, probably help them with their nonprofit status. Yeah. So she knows her way around the business world, the law world, libraries, and English literature. So she has really got all of the skills that are required to make a good biography. And I guess that's about all we have to tell you about her. She will sign your books at the end of class, which will raise the value of your copy immeasurably. Okay? So
as long as I put just my name on it, don't say it to anybody, it's just my name, then it raises its value.
Oh, see, yeah. She knows the same points. If there's an
but I'm happy to do whatever you want.
Yeah, if there's an inscription that's less valuable?
Evidently, I've been told. Yeah. There are people that buy books like this, or books in general, and get the author just to sign his or her name, and specifically say no inscription, because then you can, it's a tip-off that they're probably going to sell the book.
I see.
Anyway,
okay.
So I'll do whatever.
Okay, so take it away, Kate.
Great. I'm delighted to be here to talk about Jim Thorpe. What I was going to do is start with about 20 minutes to half an hour with a PowerPoint slideshow of his life and identify the different pivots and parts of that life that were a challenge to me as the biographer, and to any biographer. When there's something happened or something altered his life, the trajectory of it, and why that was important to a biographer. And then I'll speak about the process of actually writing it, what goes into writing a biography, this one in particular. Setbacks, difficulties, discoveries, whatever, and how to structure your narrative. And then we'll do Q&A. And I wanted to start out with reading, it pertains to this photograph. This is the Knopf hardcover cover. You all, I think, mostly have the paperback, I see, which I like the paperback picture better. But anyway, they chose this one. But this is a really good photo of him as a professional football player. The C is for Canton, Ohio. And I kicked off the book with this few paragraphs, 2 or 3, that I'd like to sort of set the themes for what we're going to talk about. It is late on a cold afternoon in November, about 7 years since his world collapsed. His name was struck from the official record of the 1912 Olympics, his gold medals for the pentathlon and decathlon stripped from him. For playing minor league professional baseball for 2 summers, he was expelled from the elitist stratum of Olympic sports, branded a pariah among those Simon Pure amateurs. The shock remains in his head, a nightmare that never ends. Though hardly an innocent, he would never understand exactly what he did wrong. He radiates sadness, though there's a hint of a good-natured smile. His stance seems to say that a photograph is beside the point. His life is about movement, not still poses for posterity. The sweater is scratchy and stiff and smells like sweat. The big white C stands for Canton, Ohio, Bulldogs, which, by the way, is why the Pro Football Hall of Fame is in Canton. It's because of him. A rough, early professional football team. The leather pants are crude and loose and held up by laces. Tied together at the waist, his body is solid and compact. He has big shoulders, hips thrust slightly forward, feet pointed straight ahead, like, as whites said back then, and Indians. The top of the face also triggers old white preconceptions and stereotypes of what Indians are supposed to look like. Cheekbones like Mount Rushmore, and eyes that squint with the all-seeing gaze of the warrior, the noble savage. He is the American Indian transposed to the playing field of sport, and it's a mythic transfer at that. Jim Thorpe, consumed by sports just as they now consume us, was the first world-class celebrity sports figure, and perhaps the finest all-around athlete America ever produced. His example prompted countless collegiate and now professional teams to choose the Indian as their mascot. And we know there's a huge controversy over the Washington Redskins as their mascot for the game that was seen when he played as a symbolic reenactment of the territorial wars that had so recently won the American land for the whites. A mixed-blood Indian, partially white, he grew up on the often lawless, wide-open frontier of Oklahoma. He would internalize that chaos to make his own perpetual internal frontier, a no man's land of conflicting identities and permanent unrest that found expression and relief on the playing field of sport. So, this is Notennequa, Jim's Sac, from the Sac and Fox tribe grandmother. I put her in here. It's a wonderful photograph, but also to show right from the beginning this mixed identity of white and Indian. He was 5/8 Indian, and the rest was white. The name Thorpe comes from a white grandfather whose ancestors helped found the town of New Haven, actually. So that the white side of him is almost as interesting as the Indian. His tribes were Potawatomi, Sac and Fox, Menominee, and the rest is white. And it's a fascinating link to so many elements of early American history. So he grew up not, even though she's in traditional Indian dress of her tribe, he grew up wearing white dress, speaking fluent English, which set him apart from the rest of his tribe at that time. He grew up in this crazy, as I mentioned, frontier of Oklahoma, which was the last true Wild West. Oklahoma had been promised to the Indians, the American Indians, as their land forever. But then, as the land was settled from the Atlantic to the Pacific, all of a sudden the whites looked at Oklahoma and said, oh, that's too much land for them. Let's divide it up under the Dawes Allotment Act and give each Indian 140 acres. And guess what? That left a lot of surplus land. The surplus land was the land, those famous land runs, the Oklahoma land runs for the whites. They were going for the surplus land. So Thorpe, born in 1887, sees this enormous cultural shock of having the reservation that he grew up on and the freedom all of a sudden is surrounded by whites, and Oklahoma becomes a state in 1907. And it was the end of the American frontier. And this sets up also further this fundamental split in his identity between the white and the Indian. So he grows up, and his father can't do anything with him. He's pugnacious, he gets in fights all the time, he's already good in sports, and his father writes this now famous letter that's in the Oklahoma History Center saying, I can't do anything with him, and wants to send him off to one of the many Indian boarding schools that were a huge movement of white Indian reform. The whites felt that the Indian race, as they called it, was dying out. Vanishing was the favorite word. And if they could turn the young Indian boys and girls into whites by forcing them to learn English, making them dress like whites, they could go back to their tribes and save them from the ruin that they saw being an Indian meant. This, of course, would all change, and it was incredibly patronizing and prejudicial. But he was sent to the top of these Indian boarding schools, Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Kids were sent there. They couldn't go home for 5 years. They couldn't speak their native languages if they were native speakers. In the case of the Apaches, for example, their long hair was cut off, and they screamed as it was cut off, not because it hurt, but because their hair was part of their identity. The girls were put into little cotton calico dresses, and they were made into little mini whites, they hoped. So here's Jim. He arrived in Carlisle in 1904, but was sent off on this outing program, which placed Indian students with white families to acculturate them to white habits. And he comes back to Carlisle in 1907. I love this picture because that's just him, this sort of stance. And the socks don't match. And they never do. And he came back, and he had learned to play a very early form of football, which was a brand new sport, at Haskell Indian School in Kansas. He arrives here in Carlisle, and first he gets put on the track and field team because he had a kind of cross-training, we'd call it, in Oklahoma growing up. He chased rabbits, jackrabbits. He chased and tamed wild ponies. He climbed trees. He swam in the river. He did all this stuff totally free and was this incredibly fast, gifted athlete, which is another reason his father wanted him to go to Carlisle, because they were developing a sports program. The superintendent felt that if the Indian athletes could win in sports, they would show that they could win in anything. So he arrives, and there's a famous story of him walking. He's just arrived, and it's late in the afternoon, and the track and field team is practicing the high jump, and they've gotten as high as they can go, and they're kind of packing up their stuff to go get dinner. And Jim comes wandering by on his way to a baseball game and literally almost seems to step over the high jump and then just keeps walking off. And they go, well, who is that? And they run after him, and they bring him to Pop Warner. And Pop Warner, who was the coach, later to become very famous as one of the most important collegiate football coaches. Stanford was one place that he really made his name. But he starts here. So he goes to Jim and he says, all right, young Thorpe, you're on the track and field team. And Jim says, but I want to play football. He goes, well, you can't. You're too skinny. You're too young. You'll get hurt. Well, Jim keeps pestering, and by the fall of 1907, he's on the football team. But he doesn't make much of a mark. He just sits and watches and learns as this game, and this is a really important part of the book and his story, the game is so new that the rules are changing every year. Now we take football for granted. Then it was brand new. And they were trying to find the right balance between offense and defense and the possession of the ball. The game was pretty much controlled, began at Yale, Harvard, Penn, Georgetown, Princeton, all these upper crust elite schools. Because there was no NCAA, this little Indian vocational school, because of Pop Warner and his pushiness and ambition, they were scheduled against Carlisle, even though it was no way a college. And the Indian team starts to beat these top schools, which of course gets a lot of news coverage, which is what the superintendent wanted for Carlisle. So Jim doesn't make too much of a mark, and he's getting a little, I should mention actually in passing that these boarding schools, there's a huge movement now. These boarding schools could be just awful. I mean, worse than your typical boarding school. Brutality, horrible food, and there's all sorts of memoirs and investigations coming out now of the legacy of these boarding schools on Indian students. It really, really was incredibly painful. He missed most of that bad side because he was a pampered athlete. That whole pattern of pampering athletes that we now take for granted with big teams, Pop Warner had that down to a science. So because he didn't get complete credit for those early years from 1904 to 7 for his outing time, he was told he would have to stay longer to make up his 5 years. And he said he was supposed to graduate in 1909. He said, I'm sick of this. He was in his late teens, early 20s. The only organized sport then was baseball. It had been organized since the 1880s at least. You had contracts, you had teams, you had leagues. It was, if you were a good athlete and you wanted to make sports your career, that was it. I mean, you could do boxing, but that was completely disreputable. And baseball was a professional sport. You were paid, but it was the only game you could play. So he, as it says here, this is Jim in the middle, 2 of his Carlisle classmates. They took off to play baseball in North Carolina for a couple of summers, and he paid for it for the rest of his life, as we shall see. Remember, it was minor league baseball. It wasn't semi-pro. It was minor league. It was under the umbrella of organized baseball. It was professional, and he was paid. And we'll get to the amateur versus professional thing shortly. He doesn't do very well. I mean, he really is not that good at baseball. And I remember Frank DeFord, the commentator and sports writer, once told me that even a great athlete in all other sports, there's something about that little white ball that can drive them nuts. And he just didn't do that well. So he did not get scouted for the majors and was really kind of lost by the spring of 1911. And one of his classmates ran into him in Oklahoma, and he was bigger and he was stronger. And he said, boy, the football team needs you. You got to come back. So he goes back to Carlisle. Keep in mind, too, that Pop Warner, his coach, and the superintendent knew exactly where he'd gone in North Carolina. They knew he had played professional baseball. They will later deny it for reasons we'll get into. So Pop Warner, again, no NCAA, and at this point, by 1911, the game has a system of downs to control possession. The forward pass is legalized, It's made a safer game, and the new game favors the running back, and that's what Jim Thorpe is. He sets the sports world on fire in 1911. It becomes a phenomenon. He plays, he's big, he's strong, he's smart, he's super fast. Nobody can tackle him. He has this sort of straight arm technique, and he runs with his knees coming up like this so nobody can tackle him. And his famous little saying is, nobody tackles Jim. And he puts Carlisle even further on the map with professional football and becomes this phenomenon in 1911. And there's a great game, he beats Harvard, and he does it with 4 place kicks. And it's just this phenomenal game. I go into detail in it in the book. But so if you beat Harvard, it was pretty good. Here's the Carlisle backfield, Jim at the grinning there on the far right. Of all the sports he played, he loved football best. And I think he saw the field almost like a geometry student sees a problem. If you can see that geometry problem to solve, you know how to go. And he was like that. Warner left him to his own instincts on the field. And he had a great team, as he was always the first one to say. About that 1911 Harvard game, Sports Illustrated in 2008 pointed to that game as the highlight of a season that would have earned Thorpe the Heisman Trophy had it existed then. It didn't exist yet. Heisman was still coaching. He was named All-American that year by Walter Camp at Yale, who is known as the father of American football. So he's making his mark, definitely. And also it's doing, for the Indian students, the American Indian students, it's putting Carlisle, the school, on the map as well, and showing that if it can win in sports, by extension, football is so important as a sport in a different way than now, because it's still an elite game. There's no professional game to speak of. So it's seen as the crucible that trains the elite of this country in strategy, in tactics, and so anyone who could master that game is part of the elite, is going to rule the country. And so if the Indians can win at that, they can win at anything. And I use the term Indians, I should say, because the Thorpe family called themselves Indians. So I used that at their request. You could say American Indian or Native American. They called themselves Indians. So I will honor that. One of the reasons that Warner was so delighted to get Thorpe back was that the 5th Olympiad, the 5th modern Olympiad, 1912, to be held in Stockholm, Sweden, was coming up. And remember, Thorpe had been a pretty good track and field star before he left to play baseball. So he's back, he's faster, he's bigger, and Warner sees a contender in the Olympics. So here he is trying out. The American Olympic team held tryouts for the first time in 1912. So he tried out for the C this time is Carlisle. He's not yet at Canton. So he competed in the tryouts for the decathlon and the pentathlon. The decathlon was a brand new sport. And these were the sports that were considered even more then than they are now, the decathlon and the pentathlon, as the tests of the ultimate athlete, because they test strength, stamina, and speed. So if you can win in the decathlon, you are the uber athlete. You can do anything. So here he is trying out with the hurdles. And also, very important for Jim's career and his biography, is that this is going to be on the world stage. It's going to be in Stockholm. Nobody expected, we'll see what happens now, it was expected that in these, they were called athletics, those track and field events, that the Scandinavians would win or the English would win. And so, there's Thorpe trying out again. So he makes both of these and he goes to Stockholm. And the modern Olympics were seen as and this is ironic, thinking we're now, 1912? What's going to happen in a couple of years, World War I? The Olympics were seen as the cure for war, that if people could compete in athletic competitions, they wouldn't have to fight each other in real life. This is the entry form for athletics, for the track and field. This is Jim's handwriting. He was actually born in 1887, but he thought he was born in 1888. This part here, this is his signature. Won't read the whole thing, but what he's signing here is, I hereby declare the above statements are correct. An amateur is one who has never competed for money, prize, or for monetary consideration, or has drawn any pecuniary gain from athletics. This was the amateur standard. You could not have accepted money, sort of like doping is now. You can't have a little bit of dope and still be clean. You can't have a little bit of money for amateurism and still be an amateur. This was a threshold issue. He signed that, even though he had been paid, and paid pretty well in North Carolina playing baseball. Even though baseball had nothing to do with track and field, they didn't care. So he signs this. Warner knew what was going on. Warner was his front man, and Warner said, go ahead, sign it, it's fine. And Warner knew where he'd been in North Carolina. So he signs it. So he begins to compete, and here he is in the pole vault. He strategically chose events that he knew he shouldn't score but so high in because it might be dangerous. The pole vault, the bamboo pole could break, and then you'd have injury and couldn't continue. Here he is in the pole vault. And long story short, he wins both events by huge margins. They've never been duplicated, to have that much of a lead. And his record for the 1,500-meter Olympic record won't be beaten until the 1970s. And these records in each of these events were the proof of what a great athlete he was. And you'll see what happens to that proof. I love this picture too. Mismatched socks again. Somebody stole his shoes halfway through, and he and Pop Warner had to craft a sort of makeup pair. He called them his pet shoes, and somebody took them probably to sabotage him in some way. But here he is after having won the decathlon. It's a very modern picture. The T-shirt wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. The shorts could be today. He could have walked off a field today. And here he is at the peak. The most wonderful athlete in the world is what the King of Sweden told him as he gave him the awards. So what he does, it's very important. Again, the Olympics are brand new, so the idea of this superstar that comes out of nowhere and wins, we take that for granted. Every time we watch the Olympics, whether it's the summer or the winter, but let's say the summer, you're waiting for some amazing athlete to sort of set a new record and to surprise and shock the world. He was the first one. He was the first one, and he did it so superbly by winning both of these two really grueling events. So he's like the sports superstar and the first international celebrity athlete. He becomes the gold standard and will be for the rest of his life. Here he is back at Carlisle after winning the games for their celebration for their athletes. Pop Warner is on the left. Louis Tawanama is a Hopi Indian, and he ran in the marathon. And there's Jim. He hated this kind of thing, and you could see he's scowling. And they had a big victory parade in Manhattan for him and put him in the first car at the front of it, and he pulled that hat down over his eyes and chewed gum the whole way and just sort of slunk down like this. He hated public glare, as he put it. But this is the high point for him. I mean, now he goes back, he returns, of course, to Carlisle. He feels himself in a different kind of place. He's going to finish his diploma. He wants to get a job as a coach. He thinks with this Olympic win that he's setting himself up to marry his sweetheart, Iva Miller, who is one of his classmates at Carlisle. And everything's going really well. As Warner said, life was juicy fat for Jim Thorpe at this point. He has another phenomenal football season in 1912. Trounces Brown right here in the pouring rain and the sleeting snow. That's his last game, actually, for Carlisle, is with Brown, against Brown. And the football season ends, and then January, an enterprising reporter in Massachusetts finds out that Thorpe had played baseball for those 2 summers. And that made him a professional, which means that his wins were moot in the Olympics. It happened so fast, and within a week, he had to return all the medals and the trophies to Stockholm. Warner said, well, I knew nothing about it, and the superintendent said, we knew nothing about it, and they hung Thorpe out to dry, in effect. Warner wasn't going to compromise his ambitious ascendant career for Jim. And it was a shock. It was a horrible humiliation. The American Olympic team was red-faced because they had been lording it over everybody that they had this great superstar, and then he turns out to be a professional. So everything is ruined and they eliminate all the records that he'd made. And those records were stricken, and those would always be the records of how good he was. And they're still not on the Olympic record, official Olympic records. But they are the main proof, because each event has these incredible scores, that he was this superb athlete. So what's left for him is to go professional, and the Major League Baseball teams are circling like, wolves. And Warner, in part to sort of make it up to Jim, but also he got a nice little commission out of it. Warner signs him, again within 2 weeks, to the New York Giants, now the San Francisco Giants. They are what the Yankees are or used to be, maybe what the San Francisco Giants are now, but the Yankees at their worst, the biggest, baddest, best baseball team. They're in New York, they know it. Fans of other teams hate them. They have some of the best players and the best pitchers in the National League. To drop Thorpe, remember he didn't play baseball that well in North Carolina, to drop him into the New York sports scene was not a good idea. If you think of, for example, Jackie Robinson, Branch Rickey farmed him out to minor league teams to warm him up. So anyway, he goes in and he can't hit a curveball. I mean, he can't hit the balls from the best pitchers. So from going to this peak of adulation as the greatest athlete, now the bleacher creatures in New York are screaming, get a bat without a hole in it. And as he comes up and strikes out and strikes out and strikes out. It's really, really hard for him. And here he is with the Giants. And he's right there, opening day at the Polo Grounds. This is Thorpe. And here's McGraw, the manager, who is a piece of work. McGraw is another important element in Thorpe's biography. He couldn't get along with managers, starting with this guy. Warner could cajole him and manage him, but McGraw was used to making players stars. Thorpe was already the biggest star on the planet, so right away they clashed. McGraw micromanaged his players. He told them which bat to pick up, which pitches to swing for. Thorpe didn't want to bother with any of that, even if he couldn't hit it. So it didn't start off well with McGraw right from the beginning. So for the next 5 years, this is 1913, McGraw farms him out to good minor league teams to give him more at-bats. And we'll see this has really interesting results that had long been forgotten, actually, before I wrote the book. So he goes back and forth, getting more at-bats, getting better at baseball. And by 1915, he happens to find himself in Canton, Ohio. He's coaching, actually, for another school. And the manager of the Canton, Ohio Bulldogs, early professional team, wants him to come for the last 2 games of the season against their arch rival, Massillon, Ohio. And they win those 2 games, and he signs Thorpe for the next 5 years. Thorpe will coach and play for the Canton Bulldogs. They'll win everything. And again, that's why the Football Hall of Fame, Pro Football Hall of Fame, is in Canton, because the most famous athlete is playing for a game that's considered the reptile of sports because it's professional. People pay a little bit more attention to professional football because Thorpe is playing and winning for the team. But for the next decade and more, he'll play 2 sports every year. He'll play football in the fall, baseball in the spring, and the constant travel puts stress on his family, which is now, again, an important part of the book, is that many of the patterns of Thorpe's life we see in today's athletes. Family life, personal life suffers with what athletics demands. In 1913, he marries that Carlisle sweetheart, Iva Miller, and this is their first baby, Jim Thorpe Jr., born in 1915. And they also go on to have 3 daughters. But in 1918, this little guy is so cute, and Jim adores him, and they play together, and they bring the baby to the Polo Grounds. He becomes the mascot, in a way, of the New York Giants. He dies of inflammatory rheumatism in his father's arms. A quick death, it was terrible. And Jim and Iva packed up the little bat and baseball suit and buried them with him in Cushing, Oklahoma. And years later, when Iva dies in California, she will ask to be buried next to this little guy. Jim is never the same after that. It's a really important plot point pivot in his life, and he has 3 more daughters, 4 sons, but he will never be as close to any of them. This just breaks his heart. And only makes him more difficult to deal with. He comes back in 1919. McGraw sells him to the Boston Braves. He's so mad to be sold that he just starts to hit in 1919 for the Braves, and he's hitting as well as Ty Cobb and Joe Jackson, 2 of the greatest hitters in both leagues. And an injury takes him out of the contention at a certain point. But what I found interesting is that here's this game that was so difficult, that didn't come easily to this great athlete, and he mastered it. He mastered quietly, just kept at it and mastered the game so well that he could hit anything. The problem was he still wasn't getting along with managers. So 1919 is the last season he plays with the majors. He then goes into good minor league teams until 1922. Here he is with spring training in Los Angeles with the Pacific Coast League, Portland, Oregon Beavers. He's with Douglas Fairbanks, famous silent film star. He then finally ends up that season in Connecticut, in Hartford, an abysmal end. He's still hitting really well, but he's just kind of falling apart. And that's his last game with organized baseball. But he'll keep playing until 1928. In fact, he'll play in sort of informal baseball teams and professional football through 1928. His last game will be 1928. So here we go again, and with the athlete, what do you do when your sports career is over? What do you do when your body is not going to move anymore and you're done? And he got this reputation as a kind of Iron Man because he just kept playing and playing and playing 2 sports every season. Actually, in 1927, he played basketball as well. But the body was not taken to where he wanted it to go. So, like many, many athletes after the 1920s, which are now known as the golden age of sports, he goes out to Hollywood. But as soon as remember, 1931 is the Depression. Nobody has work. It's really, really hard. And he now is married again, and he has 3 little boys with a 4th on the way. And he finds a job digging the foundation for the new LA County Hospital. An enterprising reporter finds this picture, and it goes around the world. And of course, it's notorious. The world's greatest athlete is reduced to digging ditches for a living. Another humiliation, another difficulty. And again, because he was so famous, everybody will find these things out about him. He cannot be anonymous for the rest of his life. But Hollywood takes notice and says, oh, great. What they're doing in general with former famous athletes is putting them in the movies, often in bit parts. And this was a whole area of his life that had never been looked at before this book. And he made at least 70 movies, maybe double that. And they churned out these, what we would call stereotypical, sometimes sort of humiliating Westerns, because the advent of sound movies in 1931, the Western all of a sudden was hot again, because you could hear the galloping horses and the rifle crack shots and the bows and arrows, and many, many, many Indians came out to Hollywood to find work in the movies, even though they were playing stereotypical versions of themselves. That's Tom Mix, famous silent film star, and they were in a couple of movies together. So Jim gets a whole new career as an actor in Hollywood. But he also, and this was another discovery, very important part of his life, remember that bifurcated identity he had of white and Indian, and then he virtually has been living in the white world since he left Carlisle. And oddly enough, or maybe not so oddly, in Los Angeles, because there's so many Indians from so many different kinds of tribes have gravitated there for work, Jim is the most famous among them, becomes a spokesman for Indian causes in Los Angeles. And he forms his own casting company because he wants the studios to hire real Indians to play Indians, not Italians or Greeks or anybody who looks vaguely ethnic. The studios don't care. But he's saying, look, I know who can really ride well. I know who can shoot bows and arrows really. I know who can ride a horse. Hire us to do this work. And he starts to organize powwows and all sorts of Indian events and connects himself and his children with a heritage he really had let slide for quite a while. He's making money in the Depression. Here's what's known as a barnstorming team. He managed it, Hard Joe Indians. It's a baseball club. They'd come into town and they'd set up a quick pickup game with whoever was around, and they'd split the gate receipts and they'd just keep traveling around. He married again, as I mentioned, Frida Kirkpatrick, and this is 1934 in their home in Hawthorne, which is just south of LA. And there's one more baby yet to come. Jack isn't born yet. But again, that's the family, but also all the time reporters would knock on the door and they'd want to update the greatest athlete in the world. And he kept having to trot out, the best possible spin he could put on it. Again, rarely at home, an absent father. He was on speaking tours, film work. He and Frida get divorced about 1940. So second marriage gone. And World War II begins, and he goes to work at the Ford Motor Company. They, as part of Franklin Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy, they had converted the Ford plant, stopped making cars, and were now making Jeeps. And he was the guard at the main gate at the Ford River Rouge. And he felt he was doing something, at least, for the war effort. In 1945, He meets Patsy, and that becomes his third wife. She was a piece of work, really difficult person. But she does say to him, you're not charging enough for speaking, you should be earning more money. And they marry, and just after they marry, he takes off in the Merchant Marine. This is 1945. The war isn't over yet. He wants to serve somehow. He didn't serve in World War I. So the Merchant Marine takes him, and he starts off around the world on this ship, and halfway around, the war ends. And I got to talk to several of his shipmates who said he just was a great storyteller. You know, he'd just start telling stories, and when they're out there in the middle of the Pacific. So he comes back again to California, to Hollywood, and starts up to make some movies again. And this is The Road to Utopia. This is Bob Hope on the far end. This is Bing Crosby. Bob Hope was really good to Jim Thorpe, lent him money whenever he was short of it, which was frequent, and he called Bob Hope one of the good guys. But here's a picture, and he's back trying to make movies. And again, in Los Angeles, he's still such a famous athlete. He's still asked to so many sports events, and he can trade on his reputation. Coming up to 1950, you recall in 2000, there were all these, the best of the century, the best of the millennium, all of these sort of contests and polls. The Associated Press did a poll, a series of polls, best baseball player, best football player, golfer, leading up to the greatest athlete of the half century. And Jim won. And Babe Diedrichson, fabulous woman athlete, won as best woman athlete. Again, what struck me, and I'll get into this in a second, on how this book came together, he hadn't played anything since 1928, but the sports writers, this is the Associated Press sports writers, they had seen him play. Babe Ruth, who we remember much more vividly today, was hundreds of points behind. DiMaggio didn't even compute. That's probably thanks to the Yankee franchise. Thorpe has no team that survived, except the San Francisco Giants, but the New York Giants link is pretty thin. They remembered him still in 1950 as the greatest athlete. And so Warner Brothers made this biopic starring Burt Lancaster in 1951 called Jim Thorpe All-American. And that movie probably has done as much as anything to keep Jim's reputation alive. It still shows on TV. And so many people came up to me when I was writing the Lancaster biography in particular, and men and women, and said they saw that movie and they never forgot it, or became track and field athletes because of it. And it's kind of hokey, you know, biopic, but it has a power in it that's because of Thorpe's story. 3 years later, in '53, Thorpe dies in Los Angeles. These are all but one of his surviving children. And I knew all of them except Charlotte here, who had died by the time I started this project. They all helped hugely with this project. Really good people who had very difficult childhoods. I mean, I said to them at one point, it's a credit to you all that you turned out to be productive human beings, because they were in these boarding schools, the parents were absent, the marriages were fractured, there was a lot of cruelty. I mean, these were tough times, and parents weren't very soft on their children at all. But anyway, here they are getting ready to go to a burial ceremony for Jim. Now, what happens next is complicated, and if you've read the book, you've got it. But Jim was supposed to be buried in Oklahoma. That didn't work. He was supposed to be buried in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and finally Patsy, his widow, strikes a deal with these two towns, Mauch Chunk and East Mauch Chunk, in Pennsylvania, and that's the Lehigh River. And they hate each other. They have duplicate municipal services, you know, 2 police forces, 2 school systems, 2 everything. They need to join under one name, but neither of them will agree to take the other's name. So Patsy shows up, and she said, well, if you take Jim and do an appropriate mausoleum, you can have the name Jim Thorpe. And they think, well, that's bizarre. But they're little and they're poor, they have no jobs, and there's this idea that there'll be the Pro Football Hall of Fame there, there'll be a factory for Jim Thorpe sporting goods, there'll be a hospital for athletes. None of this will happen. So they agree. And so the 2 towns unite and name themselves Jim Thorpe. The children will remain angry for decades because the Indian burial ceremony was interrupted by Patsy. She broke into it in the middle of it, took the coffin away, and they felt his spirit had never been put to rest. So just a couple of years ago, 2 of the sons filed a federal lawsuit to have just the remains exhumed. This is how it looks now. Just to have his remains exhumed they could leave all this and they can keep the name. And it went all the way almost to the Supreme Court. And in fact, my book was used as the factual background for the petition of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to hear it, which meant that the lower court ruling stood, which said that the remains had to stay in Jim Thorpe. It was a bizarre contract between the widow and the town, and that kind of law superseded, if you will, an American Indian law that said the remains should return. The petition was done under the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which sought to correct this kind of bizarre use of Indian remains, but the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it, so that was the end of that. So it's one of the most bizarre, strange stories in American history and in American sports. But I think it's over now. I think he'll stay in Jim Thorpe, and that's the way it goes. For his Olympic records, again, people clung. This is really a very important part of his life, too. In a way, his being such a great athlete trumped his Indian identity to the American public at the time of the Olympics. So they thought he'd been robbed, that it was really unfair that these medals were taken away. So decade after decade after decade, they kept pushing the IOC to reinstate Thorpe, give him his medals back. The IOC would have none of it. They were up. I mean, he was an amateur. He had signed that piece of paper, and he shouldn't have. And they resisted until finally in the 1970s, a committee got together and petitioned. And by this time, amateurism was dying out, as we know it is now. And his medals, the originals were not given back. They couldn't find them, but they did duplicates of the medals and gave them to his family. But in typical kind of Olympic hypocrisy, if you go on the Olympic website, the IOC website, there are listed now, they didn't demote, when he was stripped of his medals, the second place was elevated to first place, moved on up. They didn't demote any of the others, so there are two winners, two gold medal winners for the decathlon and the pentathlon, which is absurd, because he won by so much. But his name is back in as a contender. And it's another bizarre twist to Jim's story. I'd like to talk now and then take some questions about what was involved in writing this book, how you write a biography. Now you have an idea of what the life was like and the complicated, as I said at the beginning, he's not a complicated person, but what happened to him was very complicated and pulls into all kinds of threads of American culture at the time. Choosing your subject if you're going to write a biography. For me, the previous book I wrote was a biography of Burt Lancaster, the Hollywood film actor and producer. And when I was going through the production files at USC in California of Jim Thorpe All-American, the 1951 Warner Brothers biopic they made after Jim was named greatest athlete of the half century, I just thought, what a story. This Native American child coming out of Oklahoma, triumphing in Stockholm and setting all this amazing records, and then look what happened to him. And I also thought, just personally, that I didn't want to write another Hollywood book because Burt Lancaster was really definitive, and I really think movies, as much as we love them, they're really a 20th century art form. And we have so many other media now that I'd just be kind of repeating what I'd already done. On the other hand, sports is for everybody now. Sports is our common denominator, the language of sports. Since Title IX, it's boys, girls, men, women. And I thought, where did that begin? Where does this passion for sports that we have now begin? And I thought, oh, Thorpe. Go back to Thorpe. Look at that life as a paradigm of the athlete's life, because so many of the things that happened to him, how do you manage life after your body's kind of caving in? How do you find another life when all you're ever trained to do is be an athlete? Wouldn't it be interesting to go back and look at how sports became so huge through his life? So that got me on that. In choosing your subject, this is a commercial book done for Knopf, which is under Random House in New York. It's different from an academic book. The person, the author, the biographer has to tell, this is also true of academia, but even more so in commercial. You have to tell the larger story and match the market. Is there a market for the story you want to tell? Just because you find some untold story about somebody doesn't mean that everybody's going to want to read it. There has to be some context and importance to that life that people will buy that book. So your first challenge is to find, you have an idea, you think it's good, you have to find an agent, because the agent will be the person who helps you shape your proposal and then will shop it around to the different publishers. You can do your market research to find an agent. I can go on this later at Q&A, but you find your agent, usually someone who's doing books like you want to do, and that's how you approach them. You say, okay, you've done this, this, and this. I want to do this. It's kind of like it. I think you'll be interested. The proposal is your blueprint. The proposal is where you structure your narrative, how you're going to tell the story. It's an art form in itself because it's a selling document, because the agent's going to go to Knopf or Harper or wherever, and that editor there has got to read that proposal and go, oh yeah, I want to do this book, and it's marketable and it'll sell. The proposal has to persuade them of that. It has to persuade a publisher that you are the person to write this book, that you have the credentials or the background to write this book, that the subject is important to warrant a whole book. Sometimes subjects are kind of interesting, but they'd make a better magazine article, long-form fiction, something like that. They're not enough to fill out a book. And lastly, that people, as I said, will buy this book. You can have something that's very interesting, and the editor will say, well, yeah, I really like this, and personally I'd like to read it, but we can't sell it. It won't have a big enough audience, if they're the big publishers. You can go to a smaller publisher, and they might bite, and that's a whole different challenge. The publishers' marketers at that level have a huge say in whether the publishers will accept the book. So when you're setting up your proposal, and this is true in academic work, I'm sure, as well, you first have to define the collections you're going to have to visit, the archives. In the case of Thorpe, it was the Pro Football Hall of Fame, the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, the USC Cinema Collection at the University of Southern California, the National Archives in Washington, where all the Indian records were. You have to define those collections. That shows in the proposal that you know how to write the book, where the material is. Then you also have to come up with your bibliography. Again, it will be much bigger by the time you finish this book, but you need to define the key books written either about your subject or about, for example, there were several books written about Indian boarding schools. I had to read those. Books about collegiate football, really good book that I had to read about the origins of that. You have to list all those. When you've got those in the proposal, and let's say you're really lucky and your agent sells it, then you have to write it. What I do, and everybody has a slightly different way, I proceed chronologically and do the research chronologically, and when you've done enough of it, and when you've finished that and got your files all set up with the paper material in it, I use paper, you go for the interviews. You have to know enough to ask the right questions of the people you're going to interview. Also, to back up a little bit in the proposal, you should list the key people you hope to talk to, because that shows you're serious and you can get access to them. That was really important with Lancaster, because that's Hollywood. You have to get through to all these movie stars and directors, and that was interesting. People often want to tell their stories. You find when you get to the interviews, they'll save their best part. Almost when you turn off the tape recorder, they'll say, oh yeah, and then they'll tell you something because they realize it's going to end and they have a chance to finish the story. So you have to kind of stick your finger and start it up again or whatever, or take notes as soon as you get in the car. What carried me through the research was a mystery to solve in both these cases. Why were these people so important to their respective fields? Why did they succeed? In the case of Lancaster, it was this independent production company that made him this huge star of 50s Hollywood that could call his own shots, which people had largely forgotten. With Thorpe, it was how he was revered for decade after decade after decade as the gold standard of sports. When I was in USC doing the research on Jim Thorpe All-American, people had written postcards, including a young Bobby Kennedy, to Warner Brothers saying, don't mess with our hero. Get his story right in this movie. I thought, he hadn't played anything for decades. Why do they care? And a good writer looks for that passion. Why did people care about this person? You want to find that out. You want to reconstruct that part of history and go back in time. In my case, a mystery to solve was to discover my own ignorance of Native American history. I grew up in California, descended from pioneers, As my brother said, we learned about Native American history the way white Southerners learn about the Civil War. You know, manifest destiny, triumphalism, the whole thing. We knew there was a really bad, sad story. You, I'm sure, now have gotten much, much better educated about this than I was. But it was sobering and really sad, and I had to shut the books many times and just walk away. It was the constant removals, the trail of tears, all of these awful, awful cruelties that were done in the name of American white progress were obviously, it's obvious, but I had to learn, and going inside to the histories of his respective tribes was important and changed me, really, in my view of American history. Roadblocks in this process was Thorpe himself. He was reserved. He was himself a kind of mystery. Who was he, and what kind of person was he? And it made me, by the end, and Carol and I were talking about it, presumptuous to try to assess the inner mind and heart of someone whose background I don't share. I'm not Native American. So there was an element, and the more I got to know his family, the more I got taken to different rituals and ceremonies, and I was just really given this wonderful insight into the nations from which he came and the Oklahoma culture out of which he came. I learned enough to know that I didn't know, that I would never know, because I'm not of that culture. So that's a good thing for everyone to learn, I think. I would not do another book about someone whose background I didn't share. I will leave that to a Native American author to do the next book about Thorpe. I think that would really be terrific. A craft question. You have to tell this story, this narrative arc, and as my editor at Knopf said, I don't want a clothesline where you go, it's born, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this. You have to take what he calls controlled tangents, and this is good for any kind of writing. You get to a certain pivot, say the modern Olympics with Thorpe, you've got to step back a little bit and contextualize those modern Olympics so that people know what they meant at the time and how important they were. But you've got to bring it right back to Thorpe. You can only go so far on these tangents, and you can't ride off into the sunset with them, which we all do, by the way. For example, the first draft that I handed in of this book, the first third of the book, I had way too much of the Native American backstory before Thorpe was even born. And my editor said, no, we don't even get to Thorpe till page 50. He said, the reader won't put up with that. He said, you need to condense this down to 3 pages, and you're going to cover these 5 points. And that's it. You've got to whack all this other stuff out, which I had taken on so seriously because I had learned so much about Native American history. You fall in love with your research. Everybody does it. But you have to step back and say, keep your eye on that ball, to use a sports metaphor. Keep your eye on your subject and don't get distracted. The final part of this process is editing. Let's say you've got the whole manuscript done, and I had this manuscript done. It had to be cut by 300 pages. 300 meaning double-spaced manuscript pages in order to conform to the needs of the publisher. But in editing, and this was really interesting to me, I discovered in really, really rigorous editing that when you take out the extraneous words, and you have to be just ruthless about this, another kind of meaning shimmers between the words that are left. So the proximity of this word to this word, if you've cut out all the extra stuff, something else emerges on the page in the mind of the reader. So it's a dynamic process. The reader then is engaged with the text in a way they don't have to be if you're lazy and you put in too many words. But if you cut it way down, there's a kind of dynamic that is the mark of really fine editing. Lastly, the value of biography. For me, Douglas Brinkley, who's a wonderful writer, he just has a new book out on Franklin Roosevelt as conservation leader. He has said that because this country is such a country of individuals, that's how we pride ourselves on being individuals and making our own mark, that biography suits American history. You can tell American history through biography in ways you can't necessarily do with other cultures. And we do that. We focus on the individual, and it makes, for biography is very important in American history. And for me, there's also a moral dimension to this, that you have, and a lot of biographers don't feel this way, but you have a person's life in your hands. And it's tempting to find all the dirt and dwell on that and go for the sensationalism. But each of these subjects, just like each of you, we're human beings. And so often, the good side of someone, the other side of it is the bad side. It goes back and forth like a coin, back and forth. And you need to bring a certain tolerance and patience and compassion without writing a Valentine of a book. You don't shirk the bad side. So when you're dealing with the family, for example, you have to make them comfortable and trust you that you can tell the human story with all the warts, but they'll trust you to put it in the right context and treat the person as a human being. So I'd love to take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions brewing in heads.
Well, you focus a lot on Thorpes' professionalism and the effect that had on his Olympics. One thing that we discussed in class was how Pop Warner paid his athletes at Carlisle. And I was wondering, when was there a shift in college athletics? Not that Carlisle was strictly college, but in college athletics from kind of this loose organization to strict amateurism in the NCAA and rules like that?
Well, amateurism, that's a good question. Amateurism was a goal, a standard for all colleges that were competing in sports. So whether it was Yale or Harvard or Carlisle, they were all supposed to be amateurs. But now, Yale and Harvard men, it was all men then, played what was called summer ball, and they would assume a name. Let's say you're Joe Smith, you take the name of Robert Miller, and you'd play, and because the photograph, they said never let them take your picture. The photograph was not so ubiquitous. There was no Social Security, so you didn't have a number you could be traced by yet. That would come in the 1930s. So it was common for upper crust and not so upper crust collegiate athletes to make money in the summer playing ball, but they changed their name, and the colleges covered for them. So the amateurism was really a sham in many ways, and it was a way of keeping ordinary people, the poorer classes, out of sports. It persisted, amateurism, until the 50s and 60s when it started to go away. At this time, Warner is by no means unusual for paying his athletes. Yale and Harvard, I mean, they had hilarious stories, well, hilarious, but not so hilarious, of athletes who were like 28, 29 years old, and they were given their own room that was paid for, and a car, and many cigarettes as they wanted, and the alumni would be slipping money under the table to a promising athlete who stayed on forever, probably never went to classes, because if it was Harvard, they had to beat Yale, or if it was Yale, they had to beat Harvard. So the alumni get involved, these men, in the reputation of the school. So all these practices were going on all the time. Yeah, so it only stops when amateurism finally is out the window. And now they're thinking of paying collegiate players. We've come full circle. Yes?
Just going on with that, I feel like that's like such a, I mean, it's like blatant like classism and all of that. Like, I don't know, Pop Warner hanging Thorpe out to dry and all of these kind of like reprehensible things that have happened. I was wondering how you kind of keep from being chastising in your tone, or like you kind of keep from personal views seeping in, because I could see that happening really easily.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
Just how you don't like present an opinion throughout the biography on like these like really terrible things, like how to keep from having like putting a personal tone.
Well, with Warner, I did. I mean, Warner's just, he does it to himself. The facts speak for themselves. I mean, he did these hung Thorpe out to dry. The fact that he knew where Thorpe went and didn't stick up for him, he wasn't going to sacrifice his own career for Thorpe. But then in the book, there is this, which is a really interesting section, was when the varsity athletes petitioned their congressman to have their school examined, to have a committee come down and look at Carlisle, because they are ashamed of what's happening in the sports. They're ashamed of what Pop Warner's doing. And a congressional committee comes down, and it ultimately kills the school, comes down and finds out that, uncovers all these things that Warner was doing, because no one was saying no. There was no supervision over him. So in the book, I go into some detail on that. and that he left. Of course, he gets away. He goes on to become this famous coach, and Carlisle makes no difference to him at all. But I think I'm pretty clear that he was pretty awful, as well as the superintendent. I mean, yeah, bad times. Does that answer your question? Good.
I thought it was super interesting that you said that after writing this book, you would never write a book about someone who came from a different culture or had a different background than you. And I was wondering, kind of in terms of that in sports, are you like a sports fanatic? Do you like sports?
I like sports history, and I grew up in California, and we all played a lot of sports, and my whole family's super sports mad.
Just because, like, for me, one of the things when I was reading the book is I'm not a sports girl, so I don't know any of the, I don't know much about football, nor do I know positions, nor do I know what, like, a special tactic. So I was wondering if you did know these things, I guess it came easily, but if you didn't, was it hard to learn that?
Oh, yeah, good question. Yeah, it was. Don't tell anybody, but I don't really understand football. No. Yeah, well, that's why I had some sports-minded friends help. But that's where the history comes in. I could get the basic strategic givens of football. You have a team here, you have a team here, and they each want to get to the other side, and it's a territorial game, and then defining the possession of the ball and offense versus defense and all of that. I could get all of that. The trick of the book, it's really a good question, was that the average reader, even a jock, so-called, wasn't going to be interested in too many of these intricacies. I just had to find out the right parts of the puzzle that furthered the narrative, like when the forward pass was legalized. Everybody can understand that. The game before that was just, batting each other. There were a lot of fatalities, deaths, and Teddy Roosevelt had a little conference in the White House to clean up football, to spread it out and make it more visible to people in the stands, but safer for the players. So, and baseball is fairly easy to understand. And I couldn't get into the sort of language. My editor put in a couple of baseball terms because he's a baseball guy. But your question's really good. I had to write the book as someone who's not a sports fanatic. And oddly enough, the people that know all that sports stuff often don't write the books because their heads are so full of statistics that they can't get out of there. Like movie people, they can't get out of the movies.
My kind of follow-up question was, like, when you thought of the target audience for the book, were you thinking of people who would be interested in the sports of it, or were you just thinking of people who would be interested in what his role was in redefining sports in American history?
The latter. I mean, in fact, one of the reviews, I forgot, in Library Journal or something, said this book is as much a piece of American history as sports history, because sports is who we are. That's why I wanted to write the book. Both these areas, movies and sports, tend to be labeled as genre books, and I wanted to write mainstream books, like you were writing about an inventor or a politician or a famous writer. Bring that kind of examination and thoroughness to these two parts of our culture that are so important to us. They're not minor. They're who we are. And sports now is really who we are. So, yeah, the latter. I wanted to show that this is such an important part of, there's no such thing as high and low culture that's common. It's all the same to me. Yeah?
I'm wondering what kind of agreement or relationship you had with Jim Thorpe's family and community, and like how you were able to meet the needs of their traditions with this book.
That's a really good question, and it's a very important one. As I said, two of his daughters and 3 of his sons were still alive. Now, there are 2 sons that still survive now. And they just were so open to my doing this. Also, what helped was that a person called Bob Wheeler, who had done a book as an extension of a master's thesis in the 70s, he'd literally hitchhiked around the country to talk to the people then in the 70s. So many of them were still alive. He taped all those interviews, and then he gave them all to me, which was great because they're dead. I couldn't get to them. He was very close with the family, too, although the family was split. I mean, the sons didn't get along with the daughters, but, and I just went to Oklahoma. I got in a motel in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and just lived there. And Grace Thorpe lived down the road, and her sister lived around the corner. And the boys, call them the boys, lived in Waurika, which is almost to Texas, and somebody else, Bill lives in Dallas. And so I would just travel around, and then there was a granddaughter. I would spend time with each of them. And we cooked together, we hung out together, they checked facts for me. They became friends. And they sensed, and then Jack in particular, Jack was the youngest of the boys, the youngest of the children at all. He was chief of the Sac and Fox tribe for a while. He was the one who, along with Grace, became most reacclimated to his Indian background. He took me on a really extraordinary day. He said there was a Potawatomi, which Jim was mostly Potawatomi, although identified with Sac and Fox. These are all originally Great Lakes tribes. There was a Potawatomi funeral, and he said, I'm going to take you to this funeral, which was really quite something because it's very small and very private. And he said, go buy a long skirt in Walmart, because you have to wear a long skirt. So I bought this long skirt. He bought me a blanket, just a fleece kind of blanket. You need a blanket. He said, okay, now you're ready. And he took me, there were 2 funerals. The first one was the Indian funeral in a wickiup structure that the Potawatomi rebuild every year. And it's just like you imagine, like you've seen in museums. And you enter counterclockwise, and you stand around, and the body was in the middle. And each person came up and remembered the deceased, all ages. And there were no more than 15 people in this wickiup. And it was amazing. I mean, another indication, again, it was a precious glimpse of what I could begin to understand, but never would totally understand. Then we went to the Catholic church that Thorpe's grandfather had helped found next to a Benedictine monastery. The Potawatomi were Catholic by tradition after the missionaries got to them. And so then there was a second ceremony that was Catholic, and then a kind of a feast afterwards for them. Then Jack had another ceremony at the Potawatomi chief's home, and they started a fire in the morning in another much larger wickiup structure. The fire was started in the morning. We then arrived there in the evening and again walked in the right way and sat down. And it was a ceremony to bless the book. And Jack said, when we do this, stop worrying. It's all going to be fine. Because I was like, oh my God, this book was overwhelming. It's going to be fine. And so they had certain rituals set up with the smoke, and he gave me a little, I should have brought it, should have thought of that, but it was a medicine bag where 4 precious elements, seagrass, tobacco, were put in this medicine bag, and that was for me. And then a pouch with tobacco in it that I could hang around my neck. This was precious, but again, oddly enough, it showed me how I would never presume to say, okay, now I'm sort of Native American. It showed me what I didn't know, and was all the more precious really for that. But that's what the family did, and they were remarkable. And Jack, I saw Jack about a week before he died. He was the one who filed the lawsuit against Jim Thorpe, and then his brothers joined in later. He was dying, and he took me to lunch, like 2 weeks before he died, and it was quite something. So, any other questions? Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.